Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners. As always, we thank you for taking the time to listen. And as always, we thank those of you who have decided to support the show, be it just an email with your opinions and thoughts or questions, and also those of you who have clicked on the donate button at jeffersonhour.com. And we really appreciate that. This week, Clay is back from France. He made it through the trip. And we spent this week's episode, well, really talking a lot, some about your tour, but about Jefferson's time in France. And it's always a fun conversation, Jefferson in France.
So 20 years ago, maybe 25, a friend of mine named Michelle Basta at the University of Nevada, Reno Library, and I did a Jefferson in France trip, and it was just splendid. And that was the template. So we did it, I think, 3 years ago, perhaps 4 now, before the pandemic, and now we've done it again. We'll do it in 2024. I always go sort of reluctantly. I don't speak French, and that makes me ashamed to be a monophonic person. But once we get there, it was just magical, David. It's magical. The French style, the cuisine, they walk. The city is unbelievable, city of lights. There's a Hemingway sort of feel, a Scott Fitzgerald sort of feel, Gertrude Stein, and then there's the effect of the two world wars, and then you hearken back to the age of Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, and it's just absolutely amazing. It has a magic that even Rome and London don't have for me, and so I love taking people, and they're all from the Jefferson Hour, and it's amazing. And one woman came up on the bus and said, "So, are you ever going to get a ranch from somebody? Is anyone ever going to give you?" Because I hear about the ranch. If I had a ranch, I'd give it to you. But are you ever really going to get the ranch? And I said, "Well, maybe somebody, sometime, somewhere." But these people know you. They listen to the show. They have questions about it. They send their greetings to you. So, and now that we're going to Greece on September 15th through 23rd of next year, I can't wait. It's not Jefferson because he was never there. Greece wasn't really yet open to the West. It was still under Islamic control, under Turkish control, and it was a place that had not yet gotten into the grand tour. But we're going there, and my first love was Homer, Greek and Latin literature, the classics. So we're going there next year, and I can't wait. And then the year after, in 2024, we'll go back to France, and I'm going to fine-tune that. We had the greatest local guide on our Globus system. His name was Ricardo, and he was hilarious. He could not have been a better host for all of us, and he made life easy. A lot of people think, oh, there's passports, and I can't speak French, and how do you exchange currencies, and how do you order food, and what if you get lost, and how do I read signs, and so on. He was there, and he makes it just absolutely easy for everyone. So it was spectacular. And then after that, I did a private trip with a few people on the Canal de Midi, the great French canal. We're going to do that as a commercial trip in 2024. It's expensive, but man, is it worth it. And so that was then. Then this summer, on July 31st through August 9th, the Salmon River Lewis and Clark trip. It's nearly full, so if you want to come on that spectacular float, Class 4 river in Idaho, but perfectly safe, that's July 31st through August 9th. So all of that. But, it's great to be back in the USA. I washed my sheets. I slept in my own bed. I started laundry. I burned some of my clothes. I have all sorts of heroic resolutions to learn French and etc. But I've already been reading more about Jefferson's time in Europe. I'm going back. I'm only here for a couple of days. I'm going to Milan now, David. I'm flying, if you can imagine it, on Sunday to Milan to give a lecture on Jefferson and music, about which I know nothing, and am learning a little at the moment. But I'll get to see. This is the great thing about this, and people will think, well, what a charmed life I have. They should see it from the inside. But I'm going to Milan, and what I'm most excited about is not my lecture. Who cares? I'm going to get to see The Last Supper. All of my life, I've wanted to see The Last Supper, Da Vinci's masterpiece. It's hard to get to now, and it's in bad shape. But I will get to see that. I'll also get to see St. Augustine's tomb in Pavia. And so for me, that's going to be a great tour. And after that, I get to go to England to see my beloved daughter, Catherine, at Oxford. She was on the canal trip and was an enormous pleasure to have as my roommate and my deckmate. So I get to go to Oxford. And while there, I'm going to go to the south of England to do research on John Steinbeck, the American novelist, and the Arthurian romance, the Mort d'Arthur, which he became fascinated by, and I'm writing a book about. So it's a heady, exhausting, extremely fulfilling and satisfying time of my life. And I know when I get back finally on the 6th of November, I'm going to collapse with strep throat because the accumulated wear and tear will have brought me down.
Okay, we're desperately close to going way too long on this podcast.
As always.
And yes, but because you were in France, I pulled a book out that someone gave me years ago, Thomas Jefferson Abroad, edited by Douglas L. Wilson and Lucia Stanton. And you think, oh, it's a story of him in France. Well, it's not. It's a collection of all of the letters he wrote when he was in France. And, endless conversations on this show about Jefferson's letters. This is pretty unique because a lot of it's not to do with policies, although that's in there, but a lot of it is personal correspondence. And I just wanted to bring it up because it's yet another insight into Jefferson. He wrote Lafayette, April 11th, 1787. He was in Nice. I am constantly roving about to see what I have never seen before and shall never see again. In the great cities, I go to see what travelers think alone worthy of being seen, but I make a job of it and generally gulp it all down in a day. That's just it's so I just bring that up for Jefferson folks who want to get yet another insight into him.
No, it's cool. I love that letter. He also says to Lafayette, hey, you're a statesman. You should get out here and go to people's huts and see how the poor people live and see if they got enough food on the table. And then you should even say you're tired so you can lie down in their beds and see if they're comfortable. And you should go see the actual state of the actual French people, because that's the only way you're ever going to be able to improve their lives. That seems slightly condescending in our time, but Jefferson did some of that. And one of your favorite letters is when he meets the woman, the French peasant woman on the street, and gives her 24 sous, gives her a few pennies on parting, and she bursts into tears of gratitude. And that's where he says, we can't let an economic class system destroy human happiness in America. We're going to have to figure out some way to prevent the 1% from controlling everything and the 99% from languishing. So these were really important cultural markers for Jefferson. I love that Lafayette letter.
There's one other one that I'll close with, and then I'll let you say goodbye, because it's kind of timely, and that's one that he wrote to Anne Willing Bingham, May 11th, 1788. We have now need of something to make us laugh, for the topics of the times are sad and eventful. The gay and thoughtlessness Paris is now become a furnace of politics. All the world is run politically mad. Men, women, children talk nothing else, and they talk much, loud and warm.
Yeah, Anne Willing Bingham was a beautiful woman. She was reputed to be one of the most beautiful women in America. She was in France. He flirted with her in his usual kind of careful way. And he wrote her several important letters, but this one is about the coming of the craziness of the French Revolution. And so he's there to witness the beginnings of the French Revolution. He sees, it's getting pretty intense here. There are food riots. The Bastille is stormed. I mean, it's heading towards the Reign of Terror. And, if we think that January 6th was a cataclysm, he's watching the actual descent into armed chaos and bloodshed everywhere.
A furnace of politics.
And so he said, that's kind of spoiled it in a certain way, because one's in France not for politics, one's in France for cuisine, for wine, for champagne, for conversation, for music, for dance, for sculpture, etc. And so it's a great letter. And, he wanted to see the French Revolution through. He came back on leave, and George Washington appropriated him to become the first Secretary of State. So he never went back, but he probably good, because the Reign of Terror was an actual nightmare. But it's amazing to see Jefferson not only participating in one revolution in his time, but witnessing a second much, much, much greater and more cataclysmic revolution, and coming back filled with new ideas because of it. So you found a couple of the great letters. That book, that's a modern library book called Jefferson Abroad. I think I gave it to you. It has a tremendous set of letters from that time and his observations of vineyards and the canal and so on. I carried it along with me. It's kind of the Bible of anyone who's traveling to France, because his letters are more interesting than any biography written about that time. He's a very, very gifted letter writer. And we'll close with this. He says in one, "A traveler, says I, retired to a chamber in an inn with only all of his possessions in a single trunk, in four walls, a simple sort of scene. His cares are all somewhere else. He sleeps when he wants to sleep. He writes when he wants to write. He reads when he wants to read. He says, this is paradise. And then it makes you wonder about all the stuff you surround yourself with and all of the rituals and baggage that we carry through life, that this is true freedom." It's one of my very favorite letters, and he wrote it in the south of France, and he was traveling incognito. He didn't have an entourage, and he really drank in French rural culture and French industrial culture and French viticulture, wine culture, as much as he had done his work as a diplomat back in Paris. So people should come on these trips. You can hear in my voice, I think, my deep enthusiasm for them and gratitude. And our friends, the Eagles, Russ and Liz, were on the trip, and they had never been abroad before, and it was just great fun.
For more information, go to jeffersonhour.com.
So we'll see you next time. Let's go to the show. This is Out of Character, Jefferson in France.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to this week's show. I'm your host, David Swenson, so pleased to be joined by its creator, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. And Clay, the last time you and I talked, you were on your way to France, and now you're back. And I was hoping we could take some time this week to talk about your trip to France and all that you saw and all that you did and the folks that went with you.
Yeah, not just France, but Thomas Jefferson's France. So Jefferson spent 5 years in France between 1784 and 1789. They were amongst the most important years of his life. And so now for the third time, twice in 3 years, I've taken a group of mostly Jefferson Hour listeners, by the way, to Jefferson's France. And it's an amazing journey. And I learned a great deal that I didn't know about Jefferson on this trip, and was able to take people from around the United States and beyond to key places in Paris that Jefferson had a relationship with, and then on to the south of France. And we even got a day altogether on the great Canal de Midi, the canal that he was so obsessed with and spent some time on in 1787. So it was a triumphant trip. And I'm always amazed, my friends. I was in Toulouse in the south of France the other day. I got up at dawn in Toulouse, France, and by 5 p.m. I was in my own home on the Great Plains of North Dakota. It took Jefferson 19 days to sail from Boston to England, and it took him more than a month to get from Boston to his diplomatic headquarters in Paris. This involved boats and carriages and a ferry across the English Channel and nights in hotels that were sometimes of extraordinary primitiveness. A month to get to his post. It takes us about 11 hours to get across the ocean to almost anywhere in Europe.
Help our listeners out, for those who don't know. Why did Jefferson go to France, the circumstances surrounding that?
He went to France in 1784. Congress had named him earlier to be one of the peace commissioners to settle the treaty after the war. But by the time he got his kit together, the peace had been established, and that commission was withdrawn. But then in 1784, he was asked to go to Europe, to France, to be a minister plenipotentiary to produce ideal commercial treaties with European powers, and if possible, to make inroads on the continent for American tobacco and rice and indigo and timber, etc. Because, I'm sure you know, until the war happened, until the revolution, our trading supervisor was Britain. We were protected by the British Navy. Our trade was almost exclusively with Britain and the Caribbean. But with independence, Britain cut off our access to all of that trade, and so our economy was languishing, and Jefferson was made a commissioner with plenipotentiary powers, that is, not just limited to France, to see if he could open up some European markets to American trade goods. He wasn't particularly successful in this, no fault of his own, but that's what led him to France. And then when Franklin was finally allowed to retire as the American minister to France, effectively the ambassador, in 1785, Congress named Jefferson to replace him. And then he spent 85, 86, 87, 88, and a little of 89 as the American ambassador to France.
He didn't really want to go, is my understanding, and that he was in a position where he was devastated by the loss of his wife in 1782. And there were some folks behind the scenes that thought this would be good for him. Is that right?
That's correct. His wife died on September 6th, 1782, at the age of 33. It was a shattering event in Jefferson's life. I mean, all of his plans had been for domestic happiness at Monticello. He had an extraordinary wife that he loved dearly. They had small children together. He saw himself as a Virginia squire who might maybe be governor or maybe a justice of the peace or whatever, but he didn't think of himself as a future president of the United States. And with her death, everything collapsed, and he was at loose ends, and he had a really tough time of it. I would say he had a nervous breakdown, and he became a grieving widower. And friends of his who admired him were shocked by how devastated he was, by how debilitated he was. It was clear to some of them that he might not recover, that he might never pull out from his grief. And so Madison, among others, thought, well, what if we send him abroad on a mission? Not only will he love European high culture, which of course he did, but this will take him away from the environs of his sorrow and maybe make it easier for him to restore his equanimity and his vitality. And that's precisely what happened. Jefferson was not a good traveler. He got seasick often when he was at sea. But he accepted this post. Of course, he had always wanted to go to Europe. Going on the grand tour of European cultural capitals was something that 18th century privileged white men did. And he had been planning to go there from the age of 20. It had never happened. And now, when he's 41 years old, he finally has the chance to see Europe in an official capacity. And so he accepted the post, and he took his one child. 2 others were left behind at Eppington with their aunt. But he took his older daughter, Martha, Patsy, with him to France. And later, one of the other daughters died, but his second child, Maria, joined them in France in 1787.
So he was sent on an official diplomatic mission. I suspect he was good at it. Was he successful?
If ever anyone was a masterful administrator of a portfolio, writing all the letters, giving the kind of attention and promptness that things required, having diplomatic suavity, not pushing too hard the way John Adams did. Jefferson was an ideal diplomat because he was discreet. He was always prepared. He was always the best prepared person in every room that he ever entered. And he loved this country. He was a champion of the United States in a way that Washington and John Adams weren't in equal measure. So he was an ideal diplomat. But what he hit was the wall of mercantilism. And by mercantilism, I mean state-sponsored monopoly of economies. So in Europe, there wasn't free trade. They protected key industries against foreign interventions. And so there wasn't free trade anywhere really in the world at this time. The United States was this upstart, ideal Republican experiment that was an advocate of free trade along the lines of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. But Jefferson hit the wall, and privilege, with a capital P, and state-sponsored economic selfishness prevented him from succeeding. The only of all the treaties that he was able to produce was with Prussia, today's Germany, which is a landlocked nation. And so from a diplomatic point of view, his time there was not pointless, but nearly so.
A thing that keeps coming to me is the time that he spent in Europe with other people. I mean, the Adams were there. Franklin was there. And he also met a woman that you say in your notes he fell in love for the last time, to Maria Causeway.
That's going to be contested, of course. So there are 3 significant romantic relationships, if you want to call them that, of Jefferson's life. First with his wife Martha, 1772 to 1782, produced 6 children, 4 of whom died before they were 10 years old. Then at her deathbed in 1782, the family tradition is that Jefferson was asked never to remarry by his dying wife. He never did, but in France he met Maria Cosway in August of 1786. She was a brilliant, diminutive, flirtatious, musically talented composer and painter. He was swept away by her allure, let's put it, and he had a probably platonic relationship with her that lasted intensely for many months and then sort of had some echoes for the rest of their lives. But she was married and went back to London with her husband, and that sort of put an end to that. And then, of course, there's Sally Hemings, and the Sally Hemings story, maybe it's a romance and maybe it's rape. It's almost certainly somewhere in between, but it certainly was a long-term relationship, lasted more than 3 decades and produced at least 6 children. So those are the 3 great romantic moments, if you want to call them that, of Jefferson's life. And Mrs. Cosway, in some ways, was the most extraordinary because in America, women were much more carefully controlled. They were reserved. They were domestic in ways that French women and European women were not. And Maria Cosway was a kind of coquettish, aggressive, and magnificently beautiful woman. And she had all the qualities that Jefferson loved. She was a musician. She was a painter. She was a lover of salon conversation. She loved landscape gardens. And so it's as if you had a fantasy. You know, you're Jefferson, you're married to an extraordinary American woman, but clearly an American woman. She unfortunately dies. You go to Europe, and then this sort of fantasy woman appears and sweeps you off your feet. As you know, he eventually wrote an 11-page dialogue to her called My Head and My Heart, debating whether it was wise to fall in love with a woman that he couldn't spend the rest of his life with. And it's a celebrated letter of October 1786. So yes, and you know where he met her was at the Hall au Bled, which was an agricultural domed mercantile house in the center of Paris. And we went there 2 weeks ago. So I took a group of people. We walked over to the Hall au Bled. It's not there anymore, but one of the columns from the building that was there in Jefferson's time still stands. And it's the new building is shaped like a dome. And so they've done justice, at least, to the footprint of this great grain mercantilist house. And it was there thanks to John Trumbull, the American painter, that Jefferson met Richard and Mrs. Cosway. And that's where the great spark occurred. So we went there. And then later, with a smaller group, we went to the Bagatelle in the Bois de Boulogne. This is a miniature house that Jefferson and Mrs. Cosway visited together. And it was at the height of their romantic effusion for each other. And you can see why. It's just one of those magnificent, almost doll-like places in Paris. And so we were able to visit personal scenes from Jefferson's life, public scenes from Jefferson's life. And I know we're about to take a break. What became the model for the final version of Monticello, the Hôtel de Somme, which was across the river from the Tuileries.
When we come back, I want to talk more to you about Jefferson and architecture, a subject I know you enjoy. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back. This week on the Jefferson Hour, we're speaking with its creator, Mr. Clay Jenkinson, about his recent cultural tour to France and Jefferson's time in France. And before we get back into that, you are doing more and more of these cultural tours. I know you have one that you're very excited about, planning to go to Greece. Correct, sir?
So this year was France, and we had about 25 people. We work with a European travel group called Globus, and they're absolutely superb at the logistics of the thing. And next year at this time, September 15th through 23rd, 2023, that's 15 through 23 of next year, we're going to Greece. Now, Jefferson never got to Greece, but he was a classicist, and I think you know, David, that my earliest interest was classical culture, and I studied ancient Greek and Latin and so on. So we're going to Greece And we'll go to Homer's Greece largely, to sites from the Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, but also to Delphi and Athens and Santorini, the most beautiful island in the world. So that's next year. And then the year following, back to France. I so love this France trip that I immediately began to plan for one in 2024. So every fall, until I can't walk anymore, we'll be going on a European cultural tour, usually in the footsteps of Mr. Jefferson, but not exclusively. But this one was so wonderful, David. You know, the French are terrific. And of course, the food, the music, the architecture, the light in Paris. You know, we went up the Eiffel Tower. You get to the top of the Eiffel Tower where they sell you a glass of champagne. You look down on one of the world's most extraordinary cities, and you just think, I'm in Paris. You know, I'm in Paris. The Eiffel Tower did not exist in Jefferson's time. He probably would have thought it a monstrosity, although he would have admired the engineering. But there's only one Paris, and Jefferson said, as I think you know, every man's first country is his own, but every rational man's second country must be France. And he, of all the presidents of the United States, he was the most committed to French culture. He was the best at French style, some of which he brought back to Monticello and the country. And he's regarded by the French people as the American after Benjamin Franklin. You know, Franklin was always like an American in France. Jefferson was a cosmopolitan in France, and he became Frenchified in ways that Franklin never did. And when he got back, you probably remember that his enemy, his frenemy, Patrick Henry said, and I'm quoting, "Mr. Jefferson has abjured his native victuals." In other words, Jefferson is now eating French food and drinking French wine, and he's gone French on us. He's no longer really an American.
When we took our break, I mentioned architecture and how much France influenced Jefferson's love of architecture.
And ours too. So, you know, all but 5 states have domed state capitals. And the U.S., of course, has a magnificent domed national capitol building. That's Jefferson. He brought the neoclassical revival to the United States, beginning with the Capitol at Richmond in Virginia, which, by the way, does not have a dome. But this really set in motion this idea that when we build a state capitol or a building of this importance, we should hearken not to American style, but back to the classical world of Greece and Rome. And so he had enormous influence in that way. But then 2 more specific things. One is that while he was in Paris, he saw the building of a new private hotel, a private building called the Hotel de Salm, S-A-L-M, and it had a dome. And he watched it being built, and he writes this famous letter in which he says he got a chair and sat in the Tuileries across the Seine River from it, and stared at it so long that the workmen thought he was crazy or maybe going to commit suicide or something. And he said he twisted his neck to see it until he got a headache every day. But then he went back again and again and again. And at that point, he decided, you know what? When I get home, I'm tearing down Monticello, which did not originally have a dome, and I'm going to rebuild it with a dome, and it's going to look a fair amount like the Hotel de Salm. So we go to that building, and right in front of it, David, is a statue put up not so long ago, about 20 years ago, of Jefferson looking at it, holding in his right hand, a quill, and in his left hand, the original design for Monticello, which had 2 stories but no dome. And so we go there, and that building really created our image of Jefferson. When you think of Jefferson, you automatically think of Monticello. And the second building was down in the south of France, in Nîmes. It's called the Maison Carrée, which means the square building. It was built in the 1st century A.D. by the nephews of Augustus Caesar, the great first emperor of Rome. It's a Greek temple, and it's magnificently preserved and now restored. And Jefferson believed it was the most perfect morsel of antiquity, as he put it. He had seen it in pattern books, but in 1787 he went to see it, and he said to an aristocratic woman friend of his in France, "Madam, I sit here every day staring like a lover at his mistress at this building." And so he got a model made of it in plaster, which you can see in Richmond in the Capitol Interpretive Center, and he insisted that Virginia use that as the model for its great new capital. So he was deeply involved in building and architecture. He's America's first great amateur architect. And then, of course, eventually he produced Poplar Forest, his second home, and the University of Virginia. So he is an architectural genius in addition to all the other things that we regard as Jefferson's achievements.
He also spent time with some soon to be quite famous Americans. One of them was quite famous, and that would be Benjamin Franklin, but John and Abigail Adams were there as well. Can you talk about that a bit?
So he gets there and gets settled, and Franklin's there. And Franklin is old and venerable and beloved. He's America's first world historical celebrity. And Franklin by now is pretty indolent, let's say. Adams would say lazy. But he was beloved, and so every day he'd get up around 11 and have a little breakfast, and then carriages would roll up to his rural place at Passy, and aristocratic women and young men and people from the U.S. and people from all over the world would come to pay respects to the man who tamed electricity. And so Adams couldn't get him to do any work because Franklin is a celebrity. And so this made Adams sputter and enraged. But nevertheless, that's the world into which Jefferson suddenly dropped. And he was able to get along very well with Franklin because, A, he understood that Franklin was venerable and one of the greatest men who ever lived, and therefore you defer to him in his advanced old age. But secondly, he knew that Franklin's style had gained us the French alliance and the French loans, and that Adams probably couldn't have achieved that because Adams was, so much of a bully and a kind of an aggressive New Englander and a righteous man who had no patience for French style. And so Jefferson got along with Franklin in a way that Adams didn't, but he served as a kind of go-between between them. But this was a great time. He and Adams were still very close friends. He and Abigail were close friends at this time. And so you think of those three having, for a while, daily meetings at Franklin's place at Passy on the western edge of Paris. It's probably the most glittering collection of Americans ever to hang out in Paris.
I'm always fascinated by Franklin's popularity in France, and I mean it was unheard of. But he was this sort of a rough American frontiersman, grandfatherly type, and brilliant. The French absolutely adored him.
He was such a celebrity that there was merchandise about Franklin, and he helped to create a cult of simplicity that was also promoted by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And the king, Louis XVI, became kind of amused, annoyed by all of this. So the rumor is, and I think it's true, he had a chamber pot, a porcelain chamber pot made with Franklin's image on the bottom. That may be an apocryphal story, but it's certainly a good one. So Franklin was the real item. He took this a little farther than he would have needed to take it, but they just lapped it up in France. And so this also drove Adams crazy because he knew that Franklin knew languages. Franklin was a printer and a writer and a diplomat and the Postmaster General of the United States and an important pure scientist, a really serious physicist and chemist. And so for Franklin to play this kind of frontiersman bugged John Adams, but almost everything bugged John Adams.
But it worked for Franklin.
It worked.
I'm kind of curious. Obviously Jefferson spent time one-on-one with Franklin. How much influence do you think Franklin had on Jefferson?
Some. I mean, Franklin was a full generation older than Jefferson, and so he looked down on Jefferson as this brilliant, idealistic young man. I think he believed that Jefferson was a little brittle and maybe a little naive and too idealistic. Jefferson looked up.
He probably was.
He was, and Jefferson was one of those people who tries not to be noticeable. He doesn't spread out and he's not the center of any room. Jefferson tries to be on the edge. His ego is under control. And so he worshiped Franklin. I mean, he thought Franklin was either the first or second most important American. So the only other rival would be George Washington. And he looked up to him intellectually and understood that Franklin was a genuine, serious, internationally acclaimed scientist, not just a guy with a kite and a key out in a thunderstorm. And so he played chess with Franklin, and he nearly won once. So Jefferson had kind of that kind of almost worshipful respect for Franklin, but they were too distant in time and circumstance to be close friends. You remember that when Jefferson was agonizing over the Declaration of Independence, Franklin told a kind of funny story about that. And Jefferson said of Franklin, he had no enemies, that he never contradicted anybody openly. He always asked a Socratic question, or, if he challenged somebody, it was in a very graceful way. And Jefferson said he's the epitome of what a person with good humor represents. And he envied all of that in Franklin. And he certainly acknowledged Franklin's greatness in terms of diplomacy. I mean, the French alliance, which brought us Lafayette and the French fleet and French loans, is probably the decisive factor in our winning the Revolutionary War.
You mentioned George Washington. I want to talk more about John and Abigail Adams, but when you mentioned Washington, Jefferson had something to do with a statue being created, and that started in France, didn't it?
All right, so the greatest sculptor in the world at this time was Houdon, Houdon, and he sculpted Jefferson, he sculpted Franklin, he sculpted Lafayette, he sculpted all sorts of people, and he was absolutely magnificent. If you want to see his work, just Google it, Houdon, pronounced Udon. And there was going to be a life-size standing, a pedestrian statue of George Washington to be in the rotunda at the new Capitol in Richmond. And so Jefferson said, there's only one person who can do that. It's got to be Udon. And so this was not the 21st century. So he eventually convinced Congress to do it with money they didn't really have. Then he approached Udon, who was not that eager to take a year-long trip to the New World, to the howling wilderness of America, to measure the face and the body of George Washington. But Jefferson convinced him to do it. So Udon crossed the Atlantic, measured, and drew. Washington went back and produced this statue, which is still standing at the center of the Capitol at Richmond. It's one of the most magnificent pieces of sculpture I've ever seen. I think it's certainly the greatest piece of American sculpture. And who was behind it? Jefferson. If there hadn't been Jefferson, Adams never would have done this. Adams didn't care a rip about such things. But this was Jefferson's exquisite, creative, and artistic sensibility, and a kind of Jeffersonian stubbornness. He not only demanded that Houdon be the sculptor of Washington, but he also demanded that the Maison Carrée in Nîmes be the model for the new Capitol at Richmond. And back home, Madison and the people who had to fulfill all these projects were rolling their eyes and saying, it's good that Jefferson's a genius because he's kind of annoying.
Well, then let's move back to John and Abigail Adams. When they were in France and Jefferson was in France, at that point, they were still pretty good friends, not the antagonists of each other that they would later become. And Abigail Adams in particular, you see her wit and her powers of observation, I guess is the way I would say it.
She's one of the great letter writers of American history, and she wrote fabulous letters about France with a kind of puritanical wit. And so the most famous is her description of Madame Helvetius, who was, Franklin's fake lover. They faked that they were in love with each other, and they would hug and kiss and so on, flirt openly. And they were two elderly people. And there's a famous letter in which Madame Helvetius comes in and she doesn't have enough clothes on in terms that Abigail Adams would approve. And then she sits slouched back in her chair in a way that no lady would ever sit. And she puts her arm around Franklin at dinner. And eventually her little lapdog wets the floor. And Abigail said, and if you can believe it, she used her dress, her chemise, to wipe up the pee. And so Abigail's just coming undone over this. Jefferson's finding it all pretty amusing. So Abigail at that time and Jefferson were very close friends, and John too, and they had of course been two of the 5 members of the committee that drafted the Declaration of Independence and 2 of the most important people in the Second Continental Congress, etc., etc. But David, the first crack came while they were in Europe, because Shays' Rebellion occurred in western Massachusetts, where Daniel Shays and others, objecting to the commercial dislocations of the war, shut down some farm foreclosures and so on, bullied some justices of the peace. This is known in history as Shays' Rebellion, and how people reacted to it told us a lot about who they were. So Jefferson wasn't there, of course, but he reacted in his usual way. He said, I like a little rebellion now and then. It's as important in the political world as thunderstorms are in the natural world. We can live with this. This is a sign that the American people still have the spirit of liberty. John and Abigail Adams were appalled by that. They saw this as mayhem, anarchy, the way people think about the January 6th riots in the Capitol, they just saw this as the beginning of chaos. And to have Jefferson say, this is okay. We shouldn't really discourage this sort of thing too much. That was the first crack. That's the first time in private they must have said, who is this guy? How reliable is this guy? He's sort of a radical. And so this is the beginning of a series of moments, including the French Reign of Terror, that drove the Adams away from Jefferson and Jefferson away from them, and eventually culminated in the breakdown of the friendship after the election of 1800.
And Jefferson wrote a number of letters to James Madison, thoughtful letters about how radical the failed state of France was.
So we travel around in this coach in France. We're in Paris for 3 days, and then we go to the south of France, and we were on the canal, and we went up actually into the mountains, or Jefferson's route to Italy when he went to peep into the classical world. And we actually took the coach up to this place where Jefferson could look over the Alps into Italy. And so it was a really extraordinary journey, David. But while he was on the last day, we had a seminar in this hotel before everyone went home for a couple of hours, and I talked about these letters. So what he saw in France was a failed state. He said, here's a beautiful country, with great fertility, 20 million people, 19 million of whom are absolutely miserable and can't put bread on the table. He said, here's a failed state. How can we avoid, in our own happy republic, ever going down that path of corruption and inefficiency and governmental waste and class systems and so on? So he wound up writing a series of very, very important letters to his closest friend, James Madison, wrestling with, do you ever have to redistribute property? Can one generation control the next generation? Is the Constitution perpetual, or should it be torn up from time to time, etc.? So he was really looking at the failed state of France and saying, what lessons can we draw, and how can we apply those lessons to make sure America remains a virtuous republic and not just another nation in the history of nations? I love those letters. That's really the takeaway, that Jefferson didn't just fall in love with Maria Cosway and great music and architecture in France. He really came back to this country in 1789, a determined liberal, we'd call him, but a determined believer that we must be proactive in preventing the United States from becoming a class-ridden oligarchy.
Great. There's a number of things that I want to ask you about, but they're going to have to wait for a moment because we need to take a short break. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. This week we're speaking with Clay Jenkinson about Jefferson and France, and Clay, your recent cultural tour to France. I'm going to sneak in one quick letter from a listener because we're talking about cultural tours. Ben Maples wrote and wanted to know if there's going to be a Cuba tour coming up in 2023. You mentioned you're going to Greece, but are you going back to Cuba?
Yeah, Greece, September 15th through 23rd, not Jefferson, but Homeric Greece, and one of my first loves, so I really hope people will join us for that. And these trips, they change my life and my perspective, and I think they do of our guests too. And by the way, not to forget the question about Cuba, but as usual, David, everyone on the bus said, who's this Swenson? Does he exist? Are you just throwing your voice? Why doesn't he ever show up at anything? Can we, what would it take for you to get him to come on a trip? And I just say, look, folks, if I've asked him once, I've asked him 1,000 times to join us. He's Candide. He likes to stay home and tend his garden. If you want to see him, come to North Dakota. We'll put the blindfold on. We'll go to the barn. We'll make an introduction. But if you expect him,
What about Cuba?
It's all true. They all ask about you, and they say, don't ever get rid of Swenson.
I'm flattered.
He said, let Swenson get rid of you, but don't get rid of Swenson. It's all true. Anyway, Cuba. So we're not going in 2023, and here's why. It's just too much trouble right now. The pandemic, the collapse of the Cuban economy, the inflationary cycle that's hit them, of course, harder than others.
But will you go again sometime?
2024 will go, but we're delaying because it's just the yo-yo effect of first Obama, then Trump, now Biden. Our policies in Cuba have been insane for 65 years. They continue to be really irrational and things are going to get better, but they're not quite there yet.
Ben Maples, keep listening, and I'm sure that Clay will keep you apprised.
I miss it.
Yeah, I know you do. There are a number of influences on Jefferson that came from France. At the risk of piling too much into one question, wine is a big deal. His wine tour. I know he went shopping when he shouldn't have and spent a fortune to bring things back to Monticello. He also brought back a number of famous recipes, and he fell in love with European gadgets, which that was my first thing with Jefferson, is he's a gadget guy.
He's an 18th century gearhead. So he brought back waffle irons, and he brought back recipes for ice cream and for baked Alaska, although it wasn't called that then, and for other things. And his protege, William Short, went on the grand tour, and Jefferson said, go to Naples and find me a macaroni press, because pasta was just something brand new. In fact, when people first ate pasta at Jefferson's White House, they're like, what's this? There was no pasta in the United States. There barely any, and pasta was really just being invented in Italy. So he brought back all these gadgets. And of course, he redesigned a plow while he was there, observing a French peasant plowing. And he brought wine dumbwaiters and food dumbwaiters and lazy Susans and you name it. Jefferson saw all sorts of wonderful things, including louvered windows, the kind of skylight windows that can turn on a pivot. He just fell in love with all this and brought back the ideas. But he also went on this unbelievable shopping spree, David. He didn't have a dime, really. And he overspent his diplomatic salary by magnitudes. He remodeled all the houses he lived in France, even though he was only going to be there for a few months or years. And he went on this shopping spree, and he brought back 85 crates of stuff. So, when we were shopping there, people were saying, I get that, but I can't get it in my luggage. Might be overweight. Jefferson brought on ship 85 large crates of sofas and chairs and china and linens and silver and ceramics and knockoff paintings of European masters. And
I don't get it. You said he couldn't afford it. How in the world did he get credit or loans, or how did he pay for this stuff?
Jefferson was hopelessly in debt all of his life, and the credit systems were quite generous. And he bought all this stuff. I'll pay for it somehow. Gets it back to the United States. He does eventually pay for it, but it takes forever, and one time his creditors kind of came after him in France, and he wrote this letter saying, I can't sleep. I'll never sleep again until I get this under control. I'm going to go on this diet. I'm not going to spend any more money. And then 3 weeks later, he's ordering cases of wine and, new scientific instruments and new writing machines. And he spent like today's millionaire or billionaire. But the difference is he couldn't pay for it. How he got away with it, it's hard to fathom. There are books written about it. And of course, you have to admire him in a certain way, because that's who Jefferson is.
Well, I don't know about that, but the wine tour that he did, I think, is really interesting. And didn't you spend some time when you were in France discussing that?
Yes, and we went to a couple of vineyards and had wine tasting and so on, which are all great fun. Yeah, he went on this wine tour. He broke his wrist in a romantic interlude with Mrs. Cosway. They advised him to go to Aix-en-Provence for the mineral waters, so he used that excuse.
He was showing off and jumped a fence or something,
right? He went not very well. He tripped. So his advisors say, Aix-en-Provence, the water's there. They may, heal this swollen wrist. So down he went, but he was really only using that as an excuse. And he went on a systematic wine tasting and cultural tour of France, taking extensive notes on trellising and vine stocks and what kind of diseases and what kind of soils and how much rain there was and what were the best wines of Bordeaux, what were the best wines of Burgundy, what were the best wines of Dijon. And he became America's first tremendous wine connoisseur and became the wine advisor to the other 4 of the first 5 presidents of the United States. He helped to develop the Bordeaux wine classification system that didn't come until 1855. He was a genius in that regard also. So he then introduced French wine to the White House, which it's been serving ever since. And they continue to feel the need to serve French wines because of Jefferson's massive early influence on such matters. And some of those wineries, David, most of them still exist, and many of them have cultural memories of Jefferson. It's astonishing to see his footprint in France.
Well, there is a little bit of darkness in his time in France, and We mentioned it, I think, in the first segment, and that would be Sally Hemings. And Abigail Adams was the first to sort of flag this. Can you talk about that?
So Jefferson brings one daughter, Martha, leaves two back in Virginia. While he's gone, his younger daughter, Lucy, dies of whooping cough and teething. So now he wants his second daughter, Maria, and it takes a long time because Maria doesn't want to come. In fact, she barely remembers her father.
But didn't they kidnap her
They tricked her onto board a ship. And Jefferson asked for an elderly black woman to be her chaperone, her escort. That woman had smallpox, so she wasn't able to come. And so his kin, the Epps, back in Eppington, sent Sally Hemings instead. And Sally Hemings was 14 years old. She was a mixed blood young woman from a family that was important in the Monticello world. And when Abigail saw 14-year-old Sally Hemings escorting 9-year-old Maria to France, she thought, uh-oh. Anyway, she came and is there for a couple of years. And her brother James was already there. That's maybe one reason why she was sent. And so James Hemings had been sent out to become a French chef at Jefferson's expense. Sally Hemings was a household domestic at Jefferson's place at the Hotel Langeoc. And if they had this relationship, which almost surely they did, it's said to have started in Paris. So he's a 44-year-old man now with a 14-year-old mixed blood American enslaved young woman. So
the Jefferson Hour is gaining new listeners all the time. And you can tell when a new listener pops up, they'll email us and say, how can you talk about this man? He did this and he did that, and he was a slave owner, and we do talk about that a lot. I do think it's really interesting, this period in France with Sally and James Hemings, and the fact that when Jefferson left France, they would not have had to return with him. Slavery was outlawed in France. Can you kind of get into that?
You're absolutely right, David. So French law prohibited slavery. And a man coming into France with enslaved people was required to register them. Jefferson did not. He just somehow made it through. While they were there, James was sent out to become a French chef, and he did become one. Sally stayed with him at his diplomatic headquarters. He had them both inoculated for smallpox while they were there, which was a very complex thing then. And towards the end of their stay there, they came to Jefferson, brother and sister, and said, hey, we've discovered that slavery is illegal here in France. We could get a pro bono lawyer and declare our independence. There's nothing you can do about it. You can't make us go back to the United States with you. Jefferson said, that's right, you can. And they said, what are you going to do about it? Why should we go back with you? And this is according to Sally Hemings' son, Madison, who gave a history in the 1870s. And he said that Jefferson agreed to do two things. He said, if you come back with me, James, and teach somebody else French cookery, I'll free you and give you some startup money. And Sally, if you come back with me, any children you have, I will free by their 21st birthday. And I don't think he necessarily meant children by himself, but any children that you happen to have, I will free. And he did. He freed her children, and he did free James Hemings and gave him $50, which then was a large amount of money. And James went up to Philadelphia. So he fulfilled that bargain, but they were right, and he knew they were right. But here's what's so interesting. He persuaded them to return with him. They could easily have, I just read about this yesterday, there were pro bono lawyers in Europe who would handle these things. They could easily have spent the rest of their lives in France. James was fluent in French. He by now was a chef. Sally Hemings was apparently a very attractive woman. She had domestic skills of sewing and cooking and so on. They could easily have spent the rest of their life in free France and not gone back. Of course, they had kin back at Monticello, but it's a very, very, very intriguing story and a depressing one, because Jefferson should have said, of course you must stay in France. This is what we should have done in the United States, is what we will eventually do. Of course, I'll be sorry to lose you, but of course you should be free. But he didn't. He persuaded them to come back. And the Sally Hemings story in some ways is even less worrisome to me than the James Heming story. If you come back and teach somebody else the cooking skills that I at great expense have had you learn, well, then maybe I'll free you. It's just so selfish and so self-interested in a kind of delightfully ugly and ugly but delightful way.
Well, we could spend an entire episode discussing this, and
As we do.
I think we have. Yeah. So Jefferson went to France. He came back, and all of a sudden he was, I think you would say, a citizen of the world because of the influences of his time in Europe. Is that fair to say?
We're in Paris. We're near the Hotel de Sambre. There's this beautiful statue of Thomas Jefferson. There's a Washington there too, and there's a Franklin, but it's Jefferson. He's America's greatest Francophile. We go to the Canal de Midi, and there are these bronze plaques at different places on the canal summarizing his life and career. He's beloved, and he's understood to be an American who really got France, who really loved and understood France and was a friend to France. And to see that much influence, to see that his presence there, even now, is as big as it is, and we didn't even go to the great Bordeaux wineries where he's remembered as a hero of wine culture. It's really moving to me, David, and it's worth a trip to France just to see that. This plaque we saw on the canal, there's no other plaque. And the only plaque is to Thomas Jefferson, who spent 9 days on it. It's not as if he spent his life as a canal worker or something, or engineer. He had a 9-day trip, but he's commemorated because of his deep, passionate love of France. And he came back so deeply cosmopolitan, and he had to come back to a much more primitive world, and particularly when he got to Washington, D.C., which was just a startup village when he became president in 1801. And he wanted to stay in France, not forever, but he was planning to go back. But when he got back in November of 1789 on a leave of absence, there was a letter waiting for him when he got back to Virginia, and it was from the new president of the new Constitution, George Washington, saying, "I've nominated you to be Secretary of State, and the Senate has approved. I assume you'll take up that office." And Jefferson was in a dilemma. He said he wanted to go back to France. He had left a lot of his belongings there. He hadn't really tidied up. And now Washington was insisting that he become Secretary of State. Jefferson accepted it because that was the right thing to do. He hated being Secretary of State. It led to one of the most unhappy periods of his life, after maybe the most happy period of his life. But that's the nature of Jefferson's sense of duty.
That's an interesting comment. I don't think I've ever heard you say that his time in France may have been the happiest of his life.
Because he was fine. How can we even explain this? He was a deeply cultured man. He was a great amateur violinist. He had an understanding of painting and sculpture. He was America's greatest architectural aficionado. He knew wine inside and out. He knew landscape gardening. He was one of those people who was just superbly educated in the fine arts and in the history of high culture. But in the United States, it's huts and frontier villages and grub. He goes to France and he sees it all in its finest epitome. It's not London, it's not Berlin, it's France. France is the cultural capital of the world at the time, and he's just swept away by all of it, and he has to come back to a much more primitive world, and he comes back to a much more conservative world. It's Calvinist, it's puritanical. Women are much more kept down and controlled in American life. What he saw in
and there was slavery,
and slavery was everywhere. And his daughter Martha, when they came back, was appalled by it and said, "Papa, we got to get out from under slavery. It's too oppressive to see this form of human exploitation day after day after hour after hour." And so he came back, but he wasn't the kind of person who said, "Oh, I long to be back in Paris." Jefferson was a deeply patriotic American, and he wanted to improve our arts to a certain extent, but he wanted to make sure that it didn't come at the expense of a class system or a cultural class system.
Well, sir, I'm so pleased that you had such a great trip to France this time, and I welcome you back.
It was a spectacular journey. I come back a little sobered because we're in such trouble as a nation at the moment. And it's a little disconcerting to see how our status in Europe has fallen because of the chaos in American life. But I'm a deep patriot too, and glad to be here. And Greece next year, I can't wait to take people to Homer's world of Greece. Greece is a whole different kettle of fish, and I'm glad to be able to bring these stories to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. And thanks to all the people who came on the trip and those who come on these trips. You know, they're all seeded by the Thomas Jefferson Hour. The Jefferson Hour is really the basis of the Loxaw Lodge winter encampments and the summer Lewis and Clark trips. And by the way, the salmon trip is not quite full for next summer, July 31st through August 9th. Lewis and Clark on the Salmon River in Idaho. It's just a pleasure. I sometimes kind of metaphorically pinch myself, David, to think that all this has been made possible by me dressing up in tights and buckled shoes. So thank you, everyone. We'll see you next week for another important edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.